Thanks for tuning in to the Digital Native Podcast. I'm Ryan Anderson with Google. Today on the show, we have Phil Taylor. Phil is the CTO of IGNW. Phil, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks, Ryan, for having me today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So I want to get into your role and IGNW. Before we do that, though, would love to just provide an introduction on yourself, how you got into technology.
Yeah. So, oh man, I was born and raised in California. My dad was in middle management with Albertsons as a general manager. So we moved around a lot as a kid. I think I was in 6 schools in 6 years kind of thing, almost like a military kid, moving around a lot. And then in 6th grade, we moved to Oregon, and that's kind of where things slowed down. And that's actually where I started getting interested into computers. I think I was, 13, 14 years old when I started to learn how to program. I was fortunate enough to have a high school that had computer programming classes. So I took a few of them early on. So I learned, QBasic back in the day, Pascal and Turbo C++, right? And one of my aunts happened to work for Borland. So she would ship me bootleg copies, or I guess not bootleg, but copies she would get comped to her as an employee of Borland for like the IDEs and for like Solaris. I remember the Unix, or FreeBSD back in the day. So I just was tinkering, got into it through tinkering and playing video games, really. Where all good kids start. You start playing the game. Well, I'm the type that likes to take things apart and put them back together. So I got bored of the games and wanted to figure out how to build the games. And so I got into programming and eventually went to college, got a CIS degree, and spent 20 years, plus now. Software engineering was mainly what I was involved with, in healthcare and finance. And started back in the VB6 days and then .NET, evaluating Delphi. I think at the time Delphi 6 was out, competing against .NET as the two major platforms in the market. And then Java was out there, but it was really only being used by like elitists in San Francisco that were startups, right? That were really, really advanced. And we had learned it in college, but it wasn't seeing a lot of adoption. So I ended up focusing on Microsoft technology for the first 10 years of my career. So pretty much everything I did in healthcare and financial services was Microsoft stack based. But what I found was I was always reaching out for open source tools that were only available in Java. So at night I was working on my startup projects using open source technology and slowly making the transition to what I'd learned in college but hadn't used in 15 years. And so I ended up leaving that world of healthcare and financial services and starting my own businesses. And when I did that, I was leveraging Java technology, and then eventually somebody had this idea of running JavaScript on the server, and I thought it was a horrible idea at the beginning because I'd written so much JavaScript in the browser and it was always a pain. But I found myself in a tough situation on a project that I needed to rewrite. So I ended up picking up Node as a skill and rewrote like a reporting server in a couple of weeks where it would have normally taken a long time. That was probably around the time that I started thinking about only building API first, driven systems that we'd call contract first, or today what we do a lot of in the market is called microservices. But this is kind of an evolving pattern. It was not looked at as a first class pattern by any of my architecture peers at the time, but I was out pushing it. It's more distributed computing concepts. So that's kind of background on me. I guess I got into operating technology as I started my own companies, or as I was asked to be the hero on certain aspects of an application or system. I was always the guy you could go to, okay, the server operators have not been able to figure out the problem. Let's call Phil in and see if he can fix it. And so I'd go in and use my operator skills on top of my developer skills to solve that problem, or be the database administrator for 6 months. And then I parlayed all that into my own startups as I started using those, and really became what I would say those were all cloud first initiatives, except for one of them, which was a hyper-converged Oracle rack appliance, right? That we were trying to take to market that had a combination of hardware and software, but much stronger on the application side and on the cloud infrastructure side at this point.
Okay, awesome. So really a nice range of different technologies, languages. Any COBOL experience?
Yeah, actually, that's funny that you asked. They taught that in college, right? COBOL and JCL, and I was literally eyes glazed over every day in class going, I don't need to learn this crap. It's horrible. Why aren't we doing more Java? But then I found myself in my first career in financial services, very old class action lawsuit. All the code was written in COBOL. Well, they wanted to get rid of those servers, so somebody had to translate it to .NET. And so I ended up stepping up to do that because I could read the COBOL code and then write the .NET code to support it and move that system forward. So it turned out to be a valuable experience.
I've read the government could use you right now.
Yeah, and then I missed in my background my last company before I came over and partnered with Dean and Andy on IGNW to bring this new modern service provider practice to market. The last company I'd done was a serverless cloud computing play, so it would be similar to like a Cloud Foundry, PaaS type service, or what we called the backend as a service at the time. But essentially, it was serverless concepts, right? So the ability to very quickly stand up a server-side API based on a set of metadata, a schema, and then be able to add RESTful hooks to it or pub sub type behaviors, but not not really having to know anything about the underlying architecture other than the concepts to participate in the platform. And that was pretty successful. Went through Techstars, raised money, took it to market, eventually exited that and came over to IGNW to apply all those practices and principles at a consulting level to enterprise software and enterprise computing versus the platform layer that we'd built there.
Awesome. So transitioning to IGNW, tell us a little about the organization and how you guys are different than other players on the market.
Yeah, I would say we're vastly different. And it's really that lens that I've been talking about, which the market is now calling digital transformation. A few years ago when we started this company, it was all about DevOps is what we were calling it, right? DevOps and SRE. But when you get into that work, and that's what made my last company successful, was the ability to automate all of our software deployments, the ability to deploy our microservices and the entire system and be able to go from, bug ticket open to feature patch resolution and deployment to production in a 15-minute to an hour cycle, right? To be able to respond to our customers. That agility is what you need today in market to stay relevant. And so, yes, DevOps is the accelerator. It's kind of the heart of that, or SRE is the heart of that. But that really means you got to change the cultural side of your business, and you got to change the technologies and tools and how you're going to market with that. So the people, process, and tools all have to change. Most people don't necessarily understand that. So what we learned was we took DevOps to market, and we need to build what we call now a full stack business, right? We need to be able to go to market with our customers from the data center to the cloud, because that's the journey that they're really on and the problems that they have. And for a lot of them, they're going to be in both environments for a long time, and maybe for the foreseeable future. In the case of like systems like COBOL, until there's cloud equivalents to run that technology, they're going to continue to operate data centers, right? And then have to bridge in and use modern technology in the cloud to do things like scale out their web tiers, right? And give elasticity around their digital experiences to their customers.
No, that's great. And so talk about your customers. I mean, what do they look like? Who are your customers? And what kind of services do you guys provide?
Yep. So, I mean, our customers are traditionally large enterprise, everybody from A to Z in that category and portfolio. We've worked with a lot of the large brands. But we also, don't really, can't think of the word, discriminate. There we go. Dang it. Don't really discriminate on our customer profile. We're also interested in high scale startups, right? Like super growth potential, potentially built their first product, got it to market. They're in this situation now where they're in hyper growth mode, but they're practices around software delivery don't line up to their ability to develop software. And so we'll help them too, right? Come in and move to GCP and adopt kind of all these process and patterns from soup to nuts to help them create more and more acceleration in their journey. I would say we shy away from a little bit from the SMB market just because we don't have as many productized offers that we can help them with. And so the cost to support and deploy the solutions that we have is much higher than they're usually willing to support financially. So I would say it's much more the larger global 2000 type organizations, but we are heavily focused in the US as well. So we will do overseas work, but it's generally through a relationship like Google that has a customer that they need help with, or through an existing customer that has like a global data center problem and they need help in one of their data centers outside of the US.
Okay, great. And skill set that you look for hiring on your team. I mean, what kind of team have you built out, and what kind of roles or skill sets are you potentially looking for in the next, 3 to 6 to 12 months?
Yep. So we define our company in kind of 3 major areas now, lines of business. When we started, I think we had 1, then we expanded to 5. Now we're back to looking at the market through like 3 different lenses. And one of them is what we call software-defined infrastructure. So anything we're doing in the data center, but has a contemporary modern IT lens on it in terms of DevOps practices and automation. So we're not just racking and stacking boxes. We're programming against the vSphere layer and automatically deploying things like Anthos, right, to help bring in more and more cloud native type patterns into the data center. So that's one skill set. So we look for a blend of traditional IT operations experience, traditional software development experience, and scripting and things like that. But then we also look for, do you have experience and exposure to concepts like DevOps, SRE, CI/CD, infrastructure as code, automated testing, all these things that build on top that really make the cloud native patterns successful. And then on the other side of the business, we've got cloud and cloud native. And so there we're definitely hiring people that have, experience in AWS, that love the idea of moving over to Google, that can easily transition. We found it's really easy to take an AWS engineer and retrain them to be a Google engineer. Little less so with Azure, but we'll still take them, if they've got experience in one of the clouds, and then we'll put them through boot camps and trainings, right, to get the GCP experience. But that's typically the hiring profile. It's either going to be one of 2 categories. Either you came up from software engineering or you came in from operations. And I like to build my teams with both disciplines because they have different viewpoints, right? The software engineer is not always thinking about what do I do at scale. Well, they might think about scale in terms of writing the algorithm to be scalable, but not how do I manage this application at scale in a live production environment. Whereas the operator comes in and joins that team, and they have a similar overlap in the ability to program the systems, but have a different lens that they're looking at it. And they're much more concerned about, is this a fault tolerant, highly available system? Do we have good fault and failure domains set up? How are we managing the technology? Do we have a good monitoring and alerting strategy around it? How do we escalate and solve tickets quickly? That type of attitude. So we look at both sides. And then the third is really enterprise architecture and software. So modern, can you build modern systems? Do you know how to take a monolithic app and make it a microservices app? Do you know how to build a cross-platform mmobile native application, web and React Native driven, that type of experience?
Awesome. And I have this question a lot. I have a highly skilled AWS engineer. What is ramp time for him to learn GCP?
Oh man, I would say if you dedicated the time to them, they could probably do it in a couple of weeks. Typically it's about 30 to 45 days because usually we're using them. They've got other things they're doing on top of making that transition. But I would say if you're just an AWS engineer and you want to make the jump, it's probably a couple weeks of solid time that you put into it. I know I came from that background, so I casually went through all the curriculum, but made the transition probably in about a week and a half's time. To fully, qualified GCP architect in terms of the technology that Google's offering. A lot of it is similar. Some of it is different. We can talk about that too a little bit later, like the advantages of GCP over AWS. There's lots of like for like constructs, but then there's some unique things to Google that are nice to have.
Awesome. And want to get into that blatant sales pitch. The GCP certified cloud architect is the highest paying per Forbes certification that you can get. And I think that's interesting. So before we get into kind of some more of the, the meat of this, talking about your customers and the folks that you're talking to, I think in your role, you talk to a lot of business leaders, a lot of technology leaders. What's top of mind with a lot of those companies? Obviously, with the current pandemic going on, there's a lot going on there, but what are some of the trends you're seeing given that and beyond that?
Yeah, I think everybody's scrambling right now to figure out how to deliver a remote workforce, which, I think that's more of a cultural thing than it is a technology thing today. I think the technology's been there for a while, and a lot of companies have more of an older guard around the board or whatnot, so it's kept them from going 100% remote or even allowing their employees to be 100% remote, even if they have physical offices. So a lot of them are scrambling right now. We're helping partners get those strategies in place for those customers. Moving to the cloud is one of those strategies, getting out of the data center management, getting to the point where they can just remote in, over VPN and make all the changes they need to in their data center. If they're not doing it in the cloud, we've got customers doing it in their data centers, so they're trying to get to that level of adoption. And then the other side of it is more of what our partners will be working on, which is, configuring those remote workforce to be able to operate. We do some consulting around that in terms of agile. I think once you've made the transition to be an agile and kind of understand and apply those DevOps SRE principles, it makes it a lot easier to be that remote workforce. And then past that, the thing that hasn't changed that's really a market driver from the beginning of this company and will be for the near future is really just this digital transformation. And then every single customer we talk to are at somewhere on the spectrum in that journey. And usually the way that starts as a business driver, it's either time to market. You need to reduce the amount of time it takes you to have an idea and take it to market, either whether that's a bug fix or a new feature addition. Mean time to resolution, right? You need to reduce the amount of time it takes your platform to recover from an incident or an outage. And then the third is really geographic expansion. Like, we've got a customer, it traditionally took them 6 months to build out a pair of data centers to support their application stack in a new region. By moving them to Google and automating and applying all these principles that we're talking about, they're going to go down to 3 to 6 weeks to provision that same set of data centers out in GCP, and they'll be able to do that anywhere in the world that there's a GCP region available. So they're really excited about that. But I would say that's the underlying theme for everybody is how do we build applications faster? How do we get to market faster? And so that's a combination of all these different projects, right? Of automating the infrastructure, automating the operations around the infrastructure, and then doing the same thing at the app layer, right? So investing in replatforming your application, using something like cloud data store instead of RDBMS system, like a relational database management system, like a SQL Server or MySQL, right? These are big investments and changes that they have to make at the application layer to make that transition. So usually the first step in that is kind of what we'll call lift and improve. You move the application up. If you can, you put it in a container and you start to take advantage of some of the cloud native patterns while another team is working on refactoring and replatforming that application completely so you can get the agility you're looking for.
Okay, awesome. And in that, I mean, what are some of the top challenges, with some of that digital transformation?
Yeah, I think it generally boils down to strategy, right? So if you've got a large application, the hardest thing you could do is try and implement all this at once, right? So yes, I'm going to go to the cloud, and yes, I'm going to replatform my application, and all of this stuff is being put into one bag. So rather than doing that, that tends to end up in a disaster where only part of the solution ends up making it through. It's better to really chunk that up in the beginning and create some logical stages for your project to say, yes, let's modernize the infrastructure. Let's move that to GCP. That will give us time back and make us more portable to work on, available to work on the other aspects of the application, like automating failure and rollover and resolution to things, which then gives more time to think about how would we plan for standing up infrastructure that is cloud native, right? So now I can start to train my guys on GCP architecture and taking advantage of deeper platform services. And then at the same time, if they can get those applications into containers, then the software teams can start to get acceleration in their process of delivering updates to the software, which then gives them time back so that they can start to think about how they would replatform. I would say a big failure on a large application is thinking that you're going to move the entire thing and replatform it all at once. There's a pattern out there called the strangular pattern. It doesn't have the nicest name, but it's the idea that rather than take this whole thing and immediately move it into microservices pattern, you start to slowly peel away at the onion, right? You're slowly taking a layer by layer and you're refactoring the application as you go so that eventually what you end up with is no more monolith left and it's all in a microservices pattern, right? But to do that, you need that DevOps process underpinning it because you're going from 1 or 2 deployments, maybe once a week or once a quarter, to potentially 40 or 50 deployments once a week or once a quarter, or however fast you want to move at that point once you've automated that stuff.
Okay, that's awesome. So, looking at IGNW, one of the things that I think is unique about you guys is that you go to market with a vendor agnostic approach. You do work across multiple cloud providers, different technologies. And I like partnering with you guys because you bring a very real and relevant kind of perspective, putting the customer first and deciding, hey, what technology based on your current investment makes sense here. You personally have experience, multiple third-party cloud providers or multiple cloud providers. But you started working and partnering with GCP uniquely a couple years ago. Take me through the story or the journey of how you guys first started working with Google. I mean, what compelled you to look further into the relationship?
Yeah, so coming off my last startup, I was definitely an AWS fanboy, but had built my solution in DigitalOcean because it was cheaper at the time, right? And so I've always had a cloud agnostic or an agnostic mindset in the way that I engineer, from a software development perspective. That's creating good abstractions in your code, right? So that you can swap out things like the database layer if you need to. If I need to target MySQL or Oracle, make that easy, so just do a little bit of planning for that up front and write your code in a way that can be done. We take that concept to the infrastructure level as well, right? So like when we built that platform before I came over here, we could have run on DigitalOcean, but we could have also run on AWS, Azure, or GCP, right? It didn't matter to us. It was whoever had the credits to help us along on our startup journey because we built our solution agnostic from the beginning. So in order to do that, we built on Docker, right? And that's really a key to, I think, the story going forward that disintermediates if you're looking for portability. And things like Anthos from Google really shine. That's one area. We launched IGNW and immediately we were doing Kubernetes work based on my background and experience and the team that we were building. And we were doing it the hard way. As if you go read Kelsey Hightower's The Hard Way, right? We were building all the Terraform. We were writing all the scripts. And it was probably a year before we started to see good distributions coming into the market on how to do that. I think OpenShift might have been one of the first ones, but it wasn't one of my favorites because it was a fork. It wasn't a vanilla upstream. So I knew it would take a long time to get features into it. So I would say we started to see signs from Google when I started to evaluate it. So I spent the first year of our business evaluating which cloud partner we'd partner with, which I'd already made a bunch of other technology choices and partnerships, but they were much smaller decisions than that one. And I was actually had a little bit of stigma with Google Cloud and was probably favoring AWS, being that in the world that I'd come from in that startup world, everybody's kind of an AWS fanboy. Most startups are launching on AWS. It was the first to market. It's kind of the old adage, you don't get fired for buying AWS, right? But that said, being the first to market also means that you're not necessarily the most innovative in today's time. And so that was one of the things we were seeing as I started to evaluate the platforms. A simple thing like billing is not simple in an enterprise, right? So at a startup level, you don't think much about your billing strategy in the cloud. But when you're an enterprise and you start consuming, and all of a sudden you've got 5 global teams or 100 global teams spinning up services all over the place, you need a really good way to track that stuff back and do either cost back or chargeback accounting. Well, Google re-envisioned how billing works in the cloud. And so they put a project concept into an organization model in there, similar to how you think about your Active Directory structure, right? We can set up an org and then groups underneath it, and all that billing gets tracked back to those relationships that we're setting up. That didn't really exist in the other clouds. So that was one big factor, right? Then when we looked at the security story, it was like Google's inventing technology all the way down to the chip layer, the Titan chip that actually protects the code that's running on the machine, right? On top of that, everything is open, and it's API driven. So we knew there would be no issues with interoperability if we wanted to build things on Google Cloud. They were very committed to that open story, which is what our story is too. We're very agnostic in the way we go to market. We're engineers at the DNA. And so that was very much in alignment. And then on the security story, another note on that is, when you go look at the compliance story, Google chose to build all their data centers as one. They didn't say we'll split and have a government Google Cloud, right? Which I have found, and we found for sure in the first year of operations with IGNW, that can be a big miss. You're working with a customer and your engineering team's building for the public cloud, and then all of a sudden the CEO targets a new customer, and does a deal with a government or a tighter regulated industry, and all of a sudden your solution doesn't work, and there's 6 months of engineering now that needs to be redone because services aren't available. So those were kind of the keys to it. And it's as simple as now you can go to a Google page and see every security and compliance check that Google Cloud is in compliance with, and all in one nice spot. And if you're running in one region, those same checks are being done in the other region if that service is available. So it takes a lot of the context off my plate, on top of the fact that by default, everything is encrypted in transit and encrypted at rest, right? So if I'm using a platform service, I know I'm protected at a very good level from the platform itself. So it gives a peace of mind and a lot less engineering to create the same solutions. And then I think you innovated a bit on pricing. I think the market's caught up a little bit on the pricing innovations, but at the time they hadn't. And so the new billing and pricing model was very appealing to us as well, the ability for customers to get a little more granular in their billing model.
No, absolutely. And with competition, the consumer gets a win. So, I mean, we're moving in the right direction. I started with Google about 2 years ago. And at the time, we'd recently announced annual revenue run rate of $2 billion. Earlier this year, we announced $1 billion. So the growth has just been awesome. But especially early in those days, I got the question, why GCP? Why? And most of the time when folks were asking that question, they were pretty skeptical. So would love to hear, up until 3-4 years ago, if I was building an application or had a startup, there was one option of where I built that. Were there areas that you were skeptical and, things that maybe you'd tell yourself in retrospect?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I was definitely skeptical as a whole with Google. I was leaning towards AWS, like I said, before I dove deep into the research on all three, just from personal experience. And then another personal experience that made me really skeptical is Google's this isn't their first forte into cloud. You launched App Engine years ago in the PaaS market. And to me, it was a flop because as a developer, I had to rewrite my application to make it work on App Engine. It didn't just work, right? Like the application would compile and run locally, and then I'd push it up to App Engine. And they would say, oh, these 50 packages you put in, you can't run those in Google Cloud, right? Like that's not okay. So go rebuild your application and solve all these problems, and then you're good to go. And so it kind of immediately threw me off the platform, and I went somewhere else, right? I took it over to like Cloud Foundry and ran it there. So I think, seeing that was no longer the approach to cloud was huge. The steps that Google had made in that progress. I think the other area that I was concerned was Google had a reputation on the consumer side of sometimes abandoning products, right? So they launched something and then 6 months later it's gone. It was a test and it's not there and it's being deleted out of the App Store or whatnot. And so I was a little skeptical about the enterprise product story. But what I found, in the last couple of years as being a partner and operating with you is that you're really, really committed to the product lifecycle story that's documented on Google Cloud. And if a feature goes into alpha, yes, it's still early, but if it makes it into beta, you can pretty much guarantee within 6 months it's going to be a generally available product. And so that gives me confidence that when I go out and talk to my customers about early features, when they've hit beta, I can start to put them in and solution them into the customer, knowing that they will be there and that they're getting better and better. And just watching we got in early on Anthos and like the early alpha, started really using it in beta, but just seeing the progress and the amount of effort that's being put into each release from Google has been phenomenal. And seeing the documentation improvements, on each release cycle, it was very much us reverse engineering some of it in the early days in alpha beta. But by the time it was getting ready for GA, there was complete documentation, and we were throwing away some of the hacks and stuff we had put together originally to make the solution work. So it's been great to see that as a partner.
No, that's great. And you spoke to, the technology I think has been there. But what's really seen an increase, or what's really seen, what I've seen transform internally is with Thomas Kurian taking over, the focus on the enterprise customer, really starting there, putting their business and their business value first and going from there and making the technology for them. So, in looking, where do customers typically get started with Google Cloud? And I guess I'd love to hear, from some of your customers, what is the technology enabling some of them to do?
Yeah, so I think, two of the things that my team's most excited about are the AI ML projects and then the CCAI projects, the contact center AI. And it's pretty crazy how quickly you can throw together a solution today with Google Cloud, even if you've got a more traditional UC product like a Cisco UC and do, like automatic call transcription. We brought in a new employee. I think he was with the company 3 weeks before he threw together a demo that shows, a full telecom stack connected to CCAI, demoing automatic transcription on the screen and doing sentiment analysis to decide if the conversation with the operator was good or bad, right? And already starting to think up new use cases for that, like automatic translations, right, from English to Spanish or English to Japanese or vice versa for customers that have big global operations. So I think that type of technology coming out of Google is really exciting. And then on the AI/ML side, we saw that flip over in 2019 from really kind of pet projects and nobody spending a lot of money in it to full-blown production grade real projects out there with AI/ML, and the customers are able to put the data science teams together and leverage the technology. Google's making that easier, but we're able to come in and help them with lifecycle management, right, on how they should set up and automate the deployment of those training environments and experiments that they're doing, and help customers reduce like the time to create an experiment from 6 weeks to 2 hours, which then gives them lots of efficiency in their AI/ML modeling. So I think those are two areas that we see platform growing really well. The big data story is amazing with Google, using BigQuery and then being able to take that and apply AI/ML to it. The next thing we're looking at is, helping customers train in the cloud and deploy on the edge. It's another scenario that we see a lot with customers as well. We want to do the training up there and use public data sets, but we want to actually run it, in our branch retail location at the edge next to where the customer is sitting, so that there's not as much latency. So maybe running it in Kubeflow on a small Kubernetes cluster that's sitting out at a retail location, or potentially, we've got a customer that's got a fleet of ships, right? And so helping them with data center operations, right? So that each one of those ships is eventually consistent. Every time they come into an area where they can be updated, the software is being developed in the cloud and then pushed down into the environment on the ships. And technology like Anthos can help ensure that entire fleet is consistent through things like Anthos Config Manager.
And you mentioned Anthos. Anthos is Google's multi-cloud offering. When folks initially get started, obviously everyone has current investments in place. What are some of the compelling themes that you're seeing when organizations or leaders start to bring in GCP? Is it kind of a multi-cloud strategy? Is it more so a complete shift from what they're currently doing? But I guess to start, are there compelling themes or certain reasons that folks are starting to look at Google?
Yeah, I think it's you see a bit of everything, right? So you do see people that are completely wholesale saying, I want to get off AWS and go to Google, or I want to get out of my data center and go to Google. But we see a lot of SaaS customers saying, I need the optionality to support all clouds. And so Google's becoming their second cloud, right? Like they may be established in AWS, but now they need help creating a truly portable solution that will run on AWS, GCP, and Azure, because their customers giving them the pressure that they want their data to reside in one of those specific locations. And so I think you're seeing that be a trend. I think a lot of times what ends up happening though with these companies is they march into cloud first. So you end up doing a number of tactical projects, or they do on their own, right? In different clouds. And we come in a lot of times and they're doing something in every cloud. And now they're finally deciding to rationalize what should the organization use as a whole, right? They said, go ahead, go build something, go try it. But now they're saying, okay, it's time to be an enterprise about this. We need governance. We need an actual strategy. We need to decide what applications we'll run in Google, what applications we run in the data center, what applications we might run in Azure. And what you're starting to see is opinions from the market on certain technologies. And obviously, people gravitate to Google for big data and for AI/ML, some of the things that I was highlighting. But solutions like Anthos can help support them on the other clouds as well, right? So we are starting to get inbound interest in doing like Anthos on Google, but add AWS as another endpoint, right? And run Anthos on AWS as well.
Okay, that's awesome. And it's yeah, it's interesting. So transitioning from that in the technology, want to talk about just your experience as an engineering leader. I think a lot of folks right now are potentially looking for new roles. But starting out, your experience as an engineer, I mean, what are some mistakes that you've made, maybe in recent history over the last few years that come to mind?
Whew, oh man, I've made a ton. I think every engineer makes a lot of mistakes over their career, right? Especially this fail fast culture, right? When you adopt agile and you start thinking about failure as an okay thing, right? As long as you can iterate on it quickly and get to the next level. I would say one of them is, moving too fast and not stopping to put something like a cloud center of excellence in place, right? If you're an enterprise, it's okay if you're a startup, you can get to the next level and then put that in place. But when you're an enterprise, that stuff gets out of hand really quick. And so you have one big success and then you just tell the team to run in and go start putting everything in the cloud. And then a year later, you look at it and you're like, oh crap, there's no way to understand the billing data. We didn't have a tagging strategy. Maybe we weren't on Google. We don't have projects set up where they're automatically allowing us to bill back and understand who's consuming what. And so we didn't apply a tagging strategy, right? Maybe we did exactly, and a lot of these are, I would say, failures are learnings that we have shared with our customers, right? Where they've come to us. Our teams tend to operate a very specific way. So I haven't encountered too many personal failures on projects that were technically related, but what we do have is a lot of customers that will go out and build things by hand rather than leveraging cloud native principles. And so then they're calling us up in at the time at which it's gotten to the point where they feel like they're running their data center that was on-prem in AWS now or in GCP now, right? They've basically lifted and shifted their entire operations. And so they've got the same thing. It's just running in a new environment, which has added complexity for them. And so we'll come in and help them understand, hey, these are the principles and practices you should apply, right? Like, so you should be deploying immutable architecture versus non-immutable architecture. So the idea that, a code is the only thing that can update a machine, right? Humans shouldn't touch a machine. And if any change needs to be made to it, it should really be what we would call a blue-green pattern, where you bring a new system up, you take the old system down. You don't really ever patch anything in place. So we do a lot of coaching on those types of things as we go out and remediate this. I'm trying to think of any major, I would say, one of the biggest things, and I guess one of the things we run into in the consulting world is ensuring that you have good process and practices in place. We're out in the market doing a lot of work. And so it can be a miss sometimes if you don't slow down and say, look, all these DevOps projects are really software as code. You should be following well-documented, good software development practices around how you do that, right? And a lot of those engineers don't come in from that mindset. They came in from an operator mindset. They may have one person on the team that's a software engineer, and that's the one person that's checking in their code every day and they're pushing it up, and the rest of the team isn't. And so you get in these situations sometimes where a team has a bad experience because the entire team's not operating the same way. And so I think setting good guidance and documentation and cultural norms with the team is important. Leveraging things like Slack for communication and deciding when you should be using that channel. And one of the things we do is on every project we kind of set up a Slack channel. We set up build notifications. We set up a channel where the entire team can rally around that project or product that we're working on and get quick, immediate feedback on it. But some of the things that you miss sometimes is the process guidance around, hey, you're all smart people, but smart people sometimes need to be reminded, hey, this is the process we follow for source code control, right? This is the process we follow for release management. So just ensuring that you have good process guidance, I think is commonly a mistake made that's overlooked or put in too late in the process where it becomes cumbersome.
No, it's great. It's great advice. Setting that, process and establishing communication. What's something you've changed your opinion on over the last couple of years? And, how do you form your opinions? Where do you get your information?
Oh man, that's a good one. I'm pretty much data driven, so my opinions tend to take shape over time. Trying to think of what I've changed my opinion on. AI/ML was a big one, right? So I came into 2019 saying we're not going to sell any AI/ML projects. We're not going to focus there. We shouldn't do anything there. Customers aren't. It's not a real technology yet, right? Well, Google had made a ton of progress in the technology and made it so easy that it's become a real thing, right? And that happened very, very quick. And so that was a big opinion that I changed for myself. I think another one would be, around serverless computing. One of the reasons I built my last cloud serverless platform was that it was really hard to build and deploy distributed systems. And I would say even, the first couple of years in serverless computing, it was still really hard to do. It took a very advanced engineer. I would say the barrier for that's coming down. So it's getting easier and easier to teach software teams. So I would say, a couple of years ago, I wouldn't have told a software team to start with serverless. I probably would have had them start with containerization. And build, but now we're doing a lot of projects that are serverless first and like React Native first, right? So 100% modern cloud native concepts. And we're seeing pretty good adoption rates for that. So that's another opinion that I think the market's matured faster than I thought it would in that respect.
Okay, awesome. And I'd mentioned, some folks potentially looking for new roles given the current pandemic. What advice do you have for young engineers just getting started, or folks who are potentially looking for a new engineering gig?
Yeah, I would say study up on the modern concepts. Read Google's handbook on SRE DevOps. Right, that's going to be key foundation to any new startup, to any enterprise that's trying to transform. So really understanding the modern contemporary technology sets is one thing, and the patterns and practices. So if you're a software engineer, make sure you know what microservices are. And you can explain them farther than the point of just saying, it's running a serverless function, because it's a little more complicated than that, right? So really understand the concept. It really roots from domain-driven design and modeling. In terms of cloud, I would say you 100% need to be an expert in one of the 3 cloud providers. And I would go Google if I were you, especially given the statistics you shared around the highest paid certifications. Not to mention that every engineer I talk to that operates in all 3, their favorite's Google Cloud. It's just the easiest experience. So, and it has the most potential, I think, for customer growth as well, in the market. So I would say, if I was just starting out, in fact, my nephew is one of my interns that I have, and that was one of the first things I had him do is I sent him through, like a Cloud 101 training, and then I sent him through modern software and DevOps practices, right? Source control management, release management, really understanding how to do. I would say another key point there is if you haven't used Git as a source control system, that's key to any of these job roles today. So really understand both Git-based source control systems like GitHub or GitLabs, or even Google's cloud source repositories, right? Those are Git-based repositories. So understand the patterns around that, and then understand how new release process and patterns work. So maybe read up on Netflix's OSS stack, read up on Netflix's DevOps concepts as well. They've been a big pioneer in the space as well. And then immutable versus non-immutable, go read Pets versus Cattle, the thesis, right? That talks about that, about treating machines like cattle or applications like cattle, so that you can grow them and replace them at any point in time. You don't have to keep one around forever.
Great advice. Thanks for sharing. Last question I have for you. What's something that folks, tuning in and watching this might not know about you outside of work?
Oh, man. I'm kind of like a furniture hobbyist. I build a lot of basic furniture. I wouldn't call myself like a furniture builder or a, what's the other word? The carpenter or anything like that. It always takes me longer to do it, but it's something I really enjoy. I enjoy the building of things, like I talked about earlier, building and tearing things apart. So that's one of my hobbies. I built some planter boxes over the weekend for my wife. She wanted to do a raised garden. I built her a whole patio furniture set last year, built a number of tables. Pretty much everything in our house is moving that direction to custom built furniture rather than buying it these days, just because it lasts longer and it's higher quality. So something I enjoy doing. Any
favorite piece of furniture that you've built?
I think it's probably that patio set right now. We use that every day. We go sit out in the sunshine, and it's kind of like, I forget which design. She always comes up with some really expensive design, and I tell her I'll just build it for her instead. So, it was like some $4,000 furniture set design that I built for like a grand, by buying the wood and doing it myself. But it's a lot of work.
That's awesome. Well, Phil, thanks again for joining. In closing, I want to bring attention to a new group called MakerForce. In response to the pandemic, folks from the community have formed a crowdsource, and they're helping alleviate the supply chain crisis with personal protective equipment. So really cool initiative. If you have a 3D printer, a lot of folks and companies have already delivered the protective masks to local hospitals. I'll include that link in the comments. Again, it's called MakerForce. Really cool initiative. You can log into the site to see how you can help and get involved. Phil, thanks again for joining. I'm excited to share it. Great to catch up.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Ryan.